You know, my colleagues talk a lot about the pretext for the war, and we all know what they are. One of the things that, you know, is not clear is at what point did the administration take that decision? And on the 20th anniversary of 9/11, which was just a little over a year ago, I hosted Bruce Riedel, my colleague at Brookings, who was then Bush's advisor on the Middle East at the White House, and Ryan Crocker, whom you know as a very accomplished diplomat who was then dispatched to Afghanistan and Iraq later on. And I just actually reposted that conversation because it was very revealing. But one of the things that was revealed was by Bruce Riedel, and he said he was just consulting his notes before he came on the panel from that period. And he said that 3 days after 9/11, he was with President Bush when President Bush called Tony Blair, then Prime Minister of Britain, and Bush told Blair on the phone, "We are going to attack Iraq." 3 days after 9/11. And Blair was apparently stunned, although, you know, Blair later, you know, not only embraced the war, became one of the biggest advocates, and to this day he doesn't apologize for it. But at the time, he was apparently stunned. And he asked Bush, well, do we have a link between the two? And of course, there was none. And so just trace that back. We can talk about why it happened. All the pretexts obviously were built afterwards. They were not done as they were merely pretexts, as we have come to know in reality, both weapons of mass destruction and later this concocted idea that we're spraying democracy in the Middle East as something, once we discovered weapons of mass destruction were not there. What I was asked to do, though, is talk a little bit about what we scholars, realists particularly in the American Academy, Jessica said scholars didn't do enough. And it's a case where actually we did quite a bit. We placed an ad that I helped organize in the New York Times in early September 2002. And the ad said, the title of the ad was, "A war with Iraq is not in America's national interest." And then we laid out the reasons why. It was signed by over 30 prominent realists around the country. So what I want to do, first of all, is give you the context of that ad, how it happened, how it came about, why we decided to do that. And by the way, to think about it, this is an ad where we had to pay, out of our own pockets, close to $40,000 to place a quarter-page ad in the op-ed page of the New York Times. This was not just asking someone, please sign this ad. It was, please sign and pay. Okay, and we all know how hard that is, how much harder it is, particularly when you're going to, in some cases, assistant professors, but most of these were senior professors. So what gave me the idea of doing the ad is three things that my colleagues talked about in terms of the mindset in our politics, in our discourse, that led to kind of like as Jessica put it, stampede toward the war. And so I happened to have done several things over the summer that led me to this conclusion. One was I was writing quite a bit on these issues at the time, right after 9/11, quite a number of articles and op-eds across the country. One, I wrote a piece against the war I think it may have been June or July, that I submitted to one of the top newspapers in the country. And I knew the op-ed editor, and I've worked with him before. And he talked to me on the phone. He said, "I like the piece, but," quote, "the train has already left the station." Okay, so we don't run pieces like that anymore. You know, that's not what we're talking about. You know, that's already yesterday's story. It so happened that I was also invited to testify before Biden's Senate committee I believe it was in August 2002, on the Iraq war. But the idea, as Jessica said, was let's look ahead. What would happen if we were to invade Iraq? Could you speak about what the Arab states would do if we were to invade Iraq? And that was the narrow mandate that was for that particular conversation. roughly the same time, I was at a round table at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York. I'm a member. At the time, the president of the Council on Foreign Relations was Leslie Gelb, late Leslie Gelb. May he rest in peace. He was somebody I knew well, and many of you who don't know him, he was, not only as a journalist, but also he actually wrote an excellent book on Vietnam called The Irony of Vietnam, The System Worked with Richard Betts. So he was somebody, and I used that book in the past actually in my international relations courses. And when I spoke against the war, he came to me afterwards and he said, I had thought that you were a realist, but you were against the war. And I said, what do you mean about a realist? He said, well, all the realists I know are for the war. And I said, I don't know a single realist who's for the war. Name them. Tell me who they are. So he named Jim Woolsey, Richard Pearl, Paul Wolfowitz, and Charles Krauthammer. And I said to him, in my field, these are not realists, these are neoconservatives. But the term neoconservative at the time, you might not know, now it's a household name. It wasn't really used much at all. People didn't even know, what is the neoconservative? This was something that emerged afterwards. So it so happened I came home and I had a conversation with my colleague at Chicago, John Mearsheimer, over something completely unrelated. And as we were talking about the conversation, I was relaying this idea that realists were for the war. And I said to him, do you know any realist at all who's for the war? He said, I can't think of any. I said, well, this is not known in our public discourse. Why don't we do an ad, run it, and we'll raise the money, we'll put it out there, and we'll at least put it out there for historical record. We had no illusion that and so then he contacted our colleague at Harvard, Steve Walton. Three of us then organized this ad to go into the New York Times, again having no illusions, but we wanted to be on the record. We did request a meeting at the White House if they wanted to meet with us, and obviously that wasn't going to happen. Every single one of the realists that we called in the country agreed, with no exception. And I have to tell you that if we had opened it up to all scholars of international relations, I think we would have had hundreds of people. We were limiting ourselves mostly to realists only because of this discourse, thinking realists who focus on power would be for the war. We wanted to make sure that was understood. And we had not a single one who said no. To my knowledge, there was two cases where one was essentially didn't sign. I did not talk to him, and that was Sam Huntington. Sam Huntington was contacted by one of my colleagues, and Sam said, quote, I'm with you in spirit, but I don't want to put my position out there publicly against some of my students who are on the other side. This is a reported conversation. I did not have it with him. And then my colleague, Tom Schelling, a distinguished scholar who was in my university, I was very friendly with him, who was completely on board, but he said, yes, but I want to wait until Powell tries at the UN, and I want to see how the UN reacts. And we waited actually to place the ad for many days to see what the outcome of that conversation would be, just to get Tom's signature. And then when nothing happened at the UN and the disappointment came, Tom Schelling signed it, and we were universal. So ultimately, it was placed in the op-ed page, quarter page, and guess what happened? On the same page, the New York Times placed a high-profile pro-war article right above it, op-ed page. Now, I want to end by saying a lot of my colleagues said we haven't really come to grips either with the mindset that led us to the Iraq War or to accountability about those who we know misled us into that war. It's not just that they failed It was a deliberate misleading into a disastrous war. And we still face it. Now, I want to give you just a little bit of an example. It's not just about what the conversation we have about Iran, but think about this agreement that just happened, which is a minor agreement, basically renewal diplomatic relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Yes, it was mediated by China, but let's evaluate it. Does it really matter who mediated it? Is the agreement good or bad? And I want to tie this a little bit to the Iraq war and the debate that we have to end. And that is that we all know how devastating the Iraq war is. My colleagues spoke about, and I can't tell you, it wasn't only devastating to us in America, to people, to veterans who still have to live, to people, people who lost loved ones, aside from the money and the national security interest and the undermining of the international global order in a way that have lost us credibility when we're trying to make a case to win the global South, as has been noted. But in the Middle East, it has been absolutely devastating. There's nothing that has been as destructive to the Middle East across the board than this single event. It's not just Iraq. Iraq is obviously devastated. But it's also true as what happened across the region. And one of the outcomes, direct outcomes, was because of the destruction of Iraq, the rise of Iranian influence and the insecurities that emerged in the Gulf have led to this incredible proxy war between Iran and Saudi Arabia. That proxy war that has emerged because of that Iraq war, that proxy war, I wrote a piece when Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, visited the White House in 2017, saying, Mohammed bin Salman, the son of the Iraq war. Because in fact, a lot of what the Saudis have done have come out of that Iraq war. And so the devastating proxy wars that have devastated, Yemen, that have been devastating to Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, and beyond, that is in large part a product of this war. And to think that we now shouldn't be pleased that Iran and Saudi Arabia should be coming together to mitigate some of those awful destructive wars between them, that is, I think, not coming to grips not only with the reality in the Middle East and the people of the Middle East, rather than think about it through a narrow prism, but also not coming to grips with our own role in bringing about that destruction. Thank you.